In this presentation, I'm going to go over your inquiry questions as well as your thesis statements. I want to provide feedback to all of you so that you can think about how to revise these statements as we move forward. To start with, most of you have chosen one of three main large categories, which is poverty, peace, justice, and strong institutions, and then life below water, along with reduced inequalities. It'll be interesting to see how these different perspectives all kind of add up and what differences there are in your research. But as you can see, the largest number is actually 13. Those are students who have not yet indicated what they are researching. The first main big categories I wanted to go over is just to kind of let you know what we're doing here. So the first thing you need to know is in any class where people are writing a paper, these are common issues. And I think some of you actually have talked about these issues when I asked you on the Google form, the difficulties that you have when you write a paper. So I want to try to point out what the mistakes are and then offer some feedback and some suggestions that you might try out and see if this works better for you. When I say, like, what does that say, that these are common issues, is that main thing is that, writing is not the easiest thing in the world, and research writing especially is not the easiest thing in the world. So I think just try to remember that this is kind of an exploration, and the goal is for you to get better at research writing so that when you transfer or you go out into a career, that these are useful things for you. The main thing is that people are getting too far ahead. Many of you want to get to the solution, or you think you already have a solution without ever doing any research. That's the opposite of college. That's the opposite of an academic way of thinking, or what folks like to call, right, an opinion. And opinions are fine on TV and in your family and in those kind of environments. But if we actually have to implement a research-based solution, right? Like, you wouldn't want to go to the hospital if you had coronavirus and take a drug that had never been tested before, but someone just says, well, my opinion is that this is great. I think it's great. You should try it. That is not how you normally live your life when you go talk to professionals. So you need to start thinking yourself as a professional. You're a professional researcher. You're a professional writer. So my main point here is just to slow down. Be very clear about the problem or the issue that you're writing about and make sure that that's very easy for someone who doesn't know anything about it to understand. And then remember your order of operations. You need to brainstorm first, do the inquiry, and then the thesis. So we can't get ahead of that until we've done each of these phases well. So you can't do really poorly on the brainstorm and expect to do super well on the thesis. Another issue that many of you are having, and you'll see this in the examples that I give you, is this is empirical research. This is not normative research. So we're looking at how, not why. So don't ask why questions, and really you should never use the word should. So try to avoid should from your papers. We're not looking at the way we wish things were. We're looking at how things are. And so we want to be able to explain how inequality happens, how poverty happens, how pollution happens, not what we wish would, if we lived on some other planet. And then try to remember that, suggest variables, right? So suggest something like, if I made a change here, this is likely to have an effect over here. But change is hard to prove. So try to get out of the idea that you're going to come up with the solution that solves the problem forever for everybody. So what makes a good thesis statement is that it's clear, it's concise, it talks about two variables, not the whole world or not everything. And then you compare the things and you can actually show evidence. So this one's tough, right? Because this is the first one I wanted to give you an example from journalism to show you what's the difference between what we're doing and what a newspaper would do. So this is in the science section of this periodical, but the statement says the pandemic is turning the natural world upside down. Now, surely that's not happening, okay? Right? But this is what newspapers do, right? It's a catchy, like, oh my God, like, let's freak out. But then we look at the actual thesis underneath. It's in smaller print, which tells you something. Widespread social distancing measures have produced some jarring effects across land, air, and sea. Now, I'd get rid of jarring, right, because that's a ridiculous phrase. But it has made an effect, right? And so, like, one example, which is kind of funny, was in this article, is that folks have been Google searching and searching through and posting on Twitter the following: the birds are getting louder. So, okay, interesting, right? So what's your evidence that the birds are getting louder? And of course, they don't have any. But they feel like the birds are getting louder because they're hearing them for the first time. Because what's actually happening is there's not as much traffic. There's not as much noise outside. And so they're hearing birds that they'd never heard before. Probably also, if I added a second variable, more people are at home more often. And so those are the actual things that are changing, right? The birds aren't changing. There aren't more birds. Although it is interesting that this is bird migration season. So birds are coming into the cities from other locations. And so people are just learning something that they had either forgotten or had neglected for such a long time. Another effect of the social distancing has been less air pollution. So it's interesting, right? When you say the pandemic is turning the natural world upside down, and yet, millions of people die every year from air pollution, and thousands of people have died from the pandemic. So you see kind of how ridiculous this thesis is when we actually compare it to something else. Because if we said air pollution kills millions of people, the pandemic has killed thousands of people, we'd want to say something like air pollution is turning the natural world upside down. Or air pollution is killing people, or people who drive cars kill other people. Then you can actually prove that. You can show the evidence and show that effect. So then I take an inquiry question that could become a thesis. So how can courts, organizations, and legislatures in big cities in America, such as New York City and Los Angeles, improve their communities? We're looking change here. The changes improve their communities. Now, the hard part about this that the person would need to be clearer about is what do you mean by their communities, right? New York City is not one single community, as everybody knows. So you'd want to look at some specific community, or you'd compare 2 or 3 communities. It would make sense if you're comparing New York City to LA that you would pick communities that you can compare. So maybe you're looking at a certain level of poverty. Maybe you're looking at a certain population that's being harassed by police. Maybe you're looking at women's rights, right? So you look at those communities really concretely in each of those areas. The problem is you should pick 2 variables, not 3. So how can courts improve the communities? 1 variable. How can organizations improve their communities? 2 variables. Legislatures, 3 variables. So I think, right, it doesn't really matter which one you pick here, but let's say you were doing a American government kind of perspective. Then you'd want to see how courts and legislatures work together to try to improve communities, and did they actually do it, right? So lots of time people pass bills, right? And then nothing really ever happens. And sometimes it's because the court doesn't enforce it, and sometimes it's for a variety of other reasons. And so that would be a good study. You'd be comparing those 2 things. I think you can compare organizations and legislatures, like nonprofit organizations, corporations, the library system, right? But you'd have to be really specific about what organizations are you talking about. And I wouldn't do more than maybe 2 organizations. Otherwise, it'll be very hard to show who's responsible for improving a community. And then I'm not sure if you could do courts and organizations. They don't tend to work together, but you could find 1 or 2 organizations that work with courts. I think it'll be harder to show that courts and organizations improve communities. But just because something's hard doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. So you could show that they don't, for example. And actually, there's been a large number of studies that have shown that courts don't have much influence in improving communities. I'll probably share this with you for you to look at if you're interested. But this is a project I'm working on with some other faculty members, some other professors. So I wanted to give you an example of kind of how this works out. We're looking at 3 separate variables, but we're looking at the question of under what conditions can humans cooperate. So we're not saying why don't humans cooperate, because there's lots of research that says that humans do cooperate. what we're trying to figure out is how could a structure be created and what rules would need to be implemented for a group of humans to cooperate on these three particular variables: sea level rise, migration flow, and homelessness. Given that we're in the structure called neoliberal capitalism. And so, in the introduction, I would be talking about what is the prevailing research and how does it talk about this question. That's kind of similar to what you're going to be doing, right? You're going to say, what is the issue that I'm working on and what do people say about it? That's how you should think about this introduction. So I want to pull two theses from the work that you all gave me. So I want to compare it to another writing that I did, a published writing, just to get you a sense of two things. The first thing is, you can tell the first one is way too long, right? So I have a thesis statement in my abstract, and an abstract is a description of the entire article. So, this individual just wrote too much. But if I took the three bolded statements that I bolded out here, that's pretty close. This is much closer to a thesis statement. Now, this person would still need to try to make this more concise, but I can't do that for them, right? Because it's hard to tell exactly what they're talking about. This could be a thesis statement here. Human rights are the most important right in any nation. Okay, and then you'd measure, is that actually true? And you'd look at 3 or 4 different nations. Or does the right to economic prosperity, or the right to home ownership, right? There's probably more rights than just human rights. And then this person each society, nation must have a strong and effective organization safeguarding the rights of the citizens are obeyed and justified. I'm not really sure what that sentence means, right? But if I look at just the first part, I'm getting the idea that human rights could be important, but if there aren't strong and effective organizations, then that might not work out. And then this person has another normative claim, right? So I'm trying to get to the empirical claim after the normative claims. These are all should statements, right? The fact is about humanity before profit. So this is all about their opinion and what they'd like to see happen, which is fine. I'll talk about that in the next slide. That's an abstract right category. But I'm not sure what you'd compare here, right? What would you research? So what you'd have to do is say, okay, what am I trying to get at in this whole kind of large opinion-based statement? So I had a similar article that I worked on. So when I was looking at, and any of you who are doing education, this is kind of a similar problem for you. I kept hearing from educators that they thought things like Blackboard, YouTube, and other technology would just automatically make you learn. And so when that did not happen, educators were pretty frustrated for about, when I wrote this I started the project in 2012. So I was curious. I said, well, I was not interested in why people didn't learn Blackboard. That's fairly obvious. But what I was interested in is, why did teachers think that just using a certain piece of technology was going to be magic? That suddenly everyone was going to learn everything. And what I learned in the literature, what I learned from my research, is that many educators have this idea of a panacea. It's an ancient Greek term for a cure-all. And so humans, like to look for solutions that will solve all of their problems. Academic researchers, at least good ones, right, ones that are successful at doing this job, they're not looking for huge solutions. What they're looking for are, how do we better understand the problem so that people can start to make their own solutions? Because there isn't one solution that's going to work for everybody. But there tends to be, 1 or 2 ways of looking at a problem that are better than others. And so what I wrote about in this particular issue was talking about, if you want technology to work across the school, in every classroom, in advising, then you have to make that be a priority. Educators have to say, okay, how am I going to use technology in the classroom? And they must be experts at it. I think many of you are seeing this firsthand. I might write something about this pandemic as well. The article that I wrote here was after Hurricane Sandy, and a lot of educators just threw everything up online and said, okay, you're going to finish everything online. The problem was is that a lot of students didn't have a home. A lot of students didn't have electricity. A lot of students didn't have money for books. And so they were thinking that like this one piece of technology was going to work for everybody, but everybody had different situations. And so the technology needed to be responsive and reflexive to the needs of individual students. So you have to do lots of different types of technology. You can't just do one. And so I don't just have a YouTube, right? I have a website, I have a YouTube. You can email me. We can set up Zoom, whatever we need to do. And so this is what this was about. This whole chapter was explaining to teachers, and I wish they would read it more, how to actually use these pieces of technology in a way that would make grading easier and that would make learning deeper, right? That people would learn more things. I want to compare this to this one on the bottom here. Criminal justice is a tricky game that involves multiple players. You either face them one-on-one or you get defeated by all. This is actually, whether the student knows this or not, this is the basis of what's called game theory. And I think you can see, right, they use the word game. It seems like it's a game. This is a great way to measure change, because you could just think about it, like the variable that you'd be looking at in here, right? Let's say this is look for wrongful conviction, let's say. The person who was wrongfully convicted would be the game player that needs to face each level of the criminal justice system in order to get free. And so if they don't get past one of the levels, right, that's what you'd be looking at. What was the variable that kept them from getting past? So this is a good way of setting up a thesis. Now, I don't think everybody has to do this. I just wanted to see the two different sides here. One is normative. One is a bunch of stuff that the person wishes it was. The other one is how the system actually works today. So we want to have a how, an empirical, not a normative, not a should. Then I looked at all of your thesis statements, for those of you who provided. I had about 30. And I came up with these categories. And so you can change categories, but I just wanted to kind of put this out there as what might be easier and what might be harder. So starting with the easier ones, when you set up a study that says, I believe that there should be, or the stepping stone to improving lives, right? That's still normative, but you can compare that to how it actually is. So it's okay to have an ideal or what's called an abstract right. So for example, you could say, in the human rights, everyone is guaranteed a quality education. However, in the inner city, in poor neighborhoods, that is usually not the case. And then you can explain why, and then do your research about what variables might need to change in order for that situation to improve. When you look at your right or the guarantee or the thing that you're studying as a thing, it's tricky, because if you say something like removing poverty, well, how do you remove poverty, right? It's not like removing a can from your cupboard. So you have to think differently about this. And if you're going to have poverty be a thing, right, if you're studying the issue of poverty, the change would have to be about the causes of poverty. So you'd have to really do research as to what are the causes of this thing called poverty. And then you'd have to pick one of those causes and do research about what could be done about that particular cause. So if I were just throwing out one, I think is probably a likely cause of poverty among a large enough group of people in New York City. When you have a family member, like a parent or a grandparent, that gets significantly sick, let's say cancer, and they either don't have health care or they have partial health care, that means the whole family suddenly has to work to try to take care of this person. If you understand that wealth is built generation by generation by generation, then what you just had there was that 3 generations are now focused on one human being. That's going to make it a lot harder for the next generation to come out of poverty. So, and this is assuming, right, that this is not like an upper middle class family. Even like a middle class family might get thrown into poverty by this. If you do the research, you'll see this happens quite a bit. So you'd have to look at what's the cause would be the lack of healthcare coverage in the United States, right? And so what could you do to change that? When we look at actors as an other, the big problem here is that you're just going to get confused the further on this research you do. I guess I'd say something like, I'm not shocked that you did this because so many teachers have you do this, and they call it neutrality or objective research. It's not. A lot of these folks have never done what's called methodology or epistemology, and if you did research in that, you'd see that this is not at all what they mean by objective or neutral. And the word neutral is not really used anymore unless you're talking about a stick shift car. But you need to put yourself within the network, right? You're an actor within the network now. You're doing research. So you're one of the people that can make a change. And that's not a feel-good thing. That's a common sense thing. Like, you're now entering into this group of people that are all trying to solve this problem. And this kind of brings it back to, there's no panaceas. There's no cure-all. So you're not going to find an answer, then you just like put it in your pocket, take it home, and then put it in, and then, wow, it works. You're entering into this whole group of people who are concerned about this issue. So you need to put yourself in this study. So it's not an actor as an other, and then you have nothing to do with it. So what you would do, and the reason why actor as an other is tricky, is that you have to start listing the actual human beings. So who are these others? Who are you talking about? Which means that you'd either have to read things that they say and cite to them, or probably easier would be just like start talking to your friends and family about this issue and jot down what they say, right? Record what they say. So then it's not some like abstract other that you've never met, but they're actually people that you know. And then from there, you'd go online and look for surveys and things like that. And I can help the folks. There's a large number of people who have this category, actor as other. I can help you with this to try to, come up with some good research techniques. This next group, these are harder. The change is not possible is just wrong. So I don't know how to say it any other way. I'd start with this basic one. It says poverty has always been around. It hasn't. And in lots of societies, tribal societies, which still exist all over the world, there's no such thing as poverty. Even in feudalism, which was the main economic system in Europe and England and Scandinavia in the 1400s and before, there's no such thing as poverty. Poverty is a particular problem that exists due to capitalism and something called surplus value. So not only is it wrong, it's like wrong for like over 150 years. People have already been writing about this. So this is when somebody says change is not possible or something has always been around. This is the problem with that kind of research, of the normative research, because you just get to give your opinions. You could spend the whole class researching why you're wrong. I'm sure that's not what you want to do. And there's 3 or 4 people that kind of have this problem, right? It's just not possible. If change wasn't possible, I'm not sure why you would come to college at all, right? What would be the point of trying to change your situation if change was not possible? So I think like what needs to happen here, because I think it'd be too hard to just change everything here, is that I think the better part of this project is looking at the rich and what they're trying to do, right? So if you were to combine this one with the previous one about the abstract, right, then, or poverty is a thing, then we would say something like, is poverty caused by the rich, right? And if so, how? And so that would be, a much cleaner thesis, because the change would then need to happen with the rich if it turns out that that's what's going on. And then the person might still believe at the end of their research that I don't think change is likely without violence, because the truth of the matter is the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, the American Revolution, right? We could go through all these very violent overthrows of the rich do work. And so, right, it could mean that you're saying without violence, right? Without violence, poverty will always be around, right? That's like saying like an abused person will continue to be abused until they're not abused. correct, right? But what we're looking at is how does something change? Now, this other two categories, we'll deal with the first one first, right? The courts as a savior. I've already kind of said this before. There's lots of research from the 60s to the 90s that shows that the courts actually don't have much influence. So if you're looking for the courts to be the thing that makes change, it's tough to really think about that because there aren't that many judges, for one. The judges write opinions down, judicial decisions down, and, those are important, but they're like one ingredient of a cake, right? So they're like the eggs of the cake. If you're going to make a cake and you just want to have, all you get is eggs, you're not going to have a very good cake. So this question should not be like, or this thesis should not be about courts as being the change, right? But it could ask a question like, how do courts work within the democratic system to make change, right? And I would probably, give you a hint here saying it's mostly about the ideology. It's mostly about the language they use and the ideals they put out, and that seems to influence people quite a bit. Now, the other one I just wanted you to see is if you're looking for a panacea, you're looking for a savior, you're looking for some external reason for everything to change, be careful, right? Because one says that stop spending so much money on foreign land. The other one says America should help the poor. So they both can't be true, right? So what's the problem with this one? Well, money probably doesn't have as much influence as you think, right? If I go to a quote-unquote poor country or I go to a poor neighborhood, I give somebody money so that they go buy food, right? So would it be easier just to give that group of people food? Or help that, give them land and let them grow their own food? Or you see the problems here? I mean, money is not going to solve this problem. And like if I gave them all the money in the world and yet there was no grocery store or there's, it's a drought, then, right, it doesn't make any difference. Or that, there's a bunch of people with weapons right outside the town and once they leave the town to go get their food, they get killed. Well, then the money was useless. So we don't want to have a thesis that says money is going to solve the problem. What we want to do is say something like, in countries where the World Health Organization has spent this amount of money, there is this amount of poor people. And then compare that to something else, right? Say, in these countries where they grow their own food, there's this amount of poor people. And then now we're starting to see, there's something we can compare here. Is it true that countries that grow their own food are doing better, have less poor people than countries that import all their food, right? It's a big deal going on right now in the United States of, a lot of people are unemployed now. And one big thing that's happening, if you're paying attention, is that food prices are starting to increase a little bit. So that means poor people and people who just lost their jobs are going to have a harder time getting food. Well, why is that? Because a lot of the food's imported, right? And so if it was grown in our local areas, people would have access to jobs, agricultural jobs, if they lost their job, and they'd have access to local food. And so this globalization problem is being a little bit clearer in the causes of poverty. The next set is that, just a few people had a hard time just coming up with inquiries. So I just want to try to churn these problems into solutions, right? So the first one is not an inquiry, but we could probably come up with an inquiry, right? So we could say, how does the United Nations define poor people? And, with the understanding that 736 million people is a lot of people. So we want to know more about how does the United Nations define that? That's how I would start my inquiry for that first one. The next one is not an inquiry, but I bet that the person would be able to find an inquiry by going through this process. So if they started with the United Nations website that I shared and picked an issue that they were interested in, there's probably lots of questions they could ask about one of those issues. After that, you'd want to go to the federal government reports and see, okay, how does the United States government see this problem? Then you'd go to the state and local, right? You look at New York State, the governor's office, and then also the mayor's office and city council to see, well, how do they look at this issue? I'm going to show you After the midterm, how to use JSTOR to find academic articles that will start to give you a model, right? A representation of how to do this work. I've given you a couple cases, and we'll apply those cases. And then I just want to say newspaper articles should and can only be used in the introduction. Okay, newspaper articles, as you saw earlier, they're not real reliable. They're not holding themselves out to be scientific journal articles. They're not saying that they've done any research. They're saying that usually what happens in a newspaper article, if you do or do not know, is they go up to a couple people, they ask them some questions, and then they write something about it. Something that your 8-year-old cousin can do. Some journalism is better than others, but journalism is journalism. It's entertainment. It's not intended to be academic in any way. So you can use that in the introduction to just kind of highlight a problem. So like newspapers are pretty good at talking about, according to such and such organization, there are 736 million people living in extreme poverty. Right? Now you could have got that from the organization, but sometimes it's easier to get it from the newspaper. So again, newspapers are probably good for looking up general information about the problem, but I would not waste any time thinking about the media beyond that. I think this next question is really good. We just need to kind of be more specific. So it's like, who do we need to get involved to fix this problem? And I'm going to be optimistic here and think that the person was including themselves in the we. So this is a good question. So if I was applying this to education or to justice, right, I would say, who are the players? Who are the people that are in this game? What skills do they have? What training do they need? And what education can they provide to other people to try to start to solve this problem? So I think this is a good way of starting an inquiry. It's just we have to be concise, right? This one was almost clear, but it just wasn't concise because you got to be specific about the problem and then specific about the people. So it's a good question, but just need to be more specific. Now, here's a bad question, right? I think when somebody has an inquiry like this, right, they're uncomfortable, and it's almost like a sarcastic answer, right? So it's like, or cynical, I guess, saying like, goal 14 is good, but I don't think it's going to happen, and I don't think it's going to happen in time that they said. And so if you turn that into a normative question, be like, why? And then the person would say, well, because human rights are nonsense. Okay, like, I don't know what you're doing in school, right? So you already know what you believe. You don't need to learn anything. So what are you doing here? So I'm going to be more optimistic, and I'm going to say this person was distancing themselves. So I would change this inquiry to be something like, what do people who care about goal 14 think needs to be done by such and such date? And then how can this be implemented? And that's what I would do as my inquiry. So it'd be less cynical and it'd be more optimistic that people have spent time thinking about this, so there must be some chance of it happening. Next set of problems has to do with definition troubles. I'm not going to go over these in detail because I think you see the common theme here, right? You need to define poverty. Who are we talking about? Make a list, right? So you got to define and make a list. Trying to think, is there anything else in there? I think the hard part about like looking at money, right, is you have to show that money is the cause, and you have to show how money could be used differently. So I think for all of these that are lacking definitions and lacking a list, you need to spend more time looking at the UN reports because you want to use their language, but they're going to start to give you definitions. And if they don't have definitions, then you go to the federal government. The federal government almost always has definitions in this issue. One search engine you can use that I'm just thinking of right now is called Congressional Quarterly. So I'm going to write that down and send that out to you all. I don't think it's great. It's not super, but it does tend to have a lot of definitions. So that's one place you can kind of go. Another one is I'll try to get you a political science dictionary. They tend to define a lot of these things as well. So they're not going to give you much information beyond the definition, but it's a good place to start because a lot of you are just having a hard time with the definition. So I'll show you in a couple of slides why that's a problem, but it'll just make your research so much easier if you know what the definitions are and what you're looking for. So again, this is not, definition troubles are not a problem with the inquiry. The definition is just saying like, well, from here, from your inquiry, before you can do a good thesis, you're going to have to come up with definitions. Word choice troubles are similar. So, I started with one that needs to be defined, right? So how is government helping improve climate crisis? Well, which government, right? New York City is doing a lot. Oklahoma is doing almost nothing, even though they're contributing a lot. California is doing a lot. The federal government is doing very little. The United Nations is doing a lot. France is, trying. So it's like, which government are you talking about? And then what do you mean by help, right? So help improve the climate crisis would be very complicated the further you get into this. China is producing a lot of carbon pollution, but they're also providing a lot of money for alternative energy. So, which one do you think is more important? I can't tell you, right? You have to make up your own mind on that. It might be easiest to start like who's not helping. I mean, that might be the start, right? And then compare them to the countries that are trying. And then you had to define the climate crisis, right? What do you mean by the climate crisis? To me, I think sea level rise is the most urgent problem. But you could look at other side. There's 5 or 6 very urgent problems, and you could rank them differently. The rest of these, I think you need to reword, right? Use this language carefully, cause, how, and be specific, right? Don't use words like the world. Be clear about what you really want to know. Don't use what or why. Change to how. And again, be specific about the groups of people that you're talking about, and the areas that you're talking about. So word choice is like tough, right? But you got to just slow down, look at your sentence, and say, okay, what am I trying to get at here? So it's okay to have like one sentence, create 3 sentences, and then draft that back down to 1. These are way too broad, so you can look at that for a second. But I just, you could never write a paper about this. You'll go nuts. And so what I'm trying to get you to do now is just be really specific, right? It's fine. These are fine as like hugely general categories. But I could assign any one of these for the whole class and I'd get 41 different papers. So what we're trying to do is get closer in, right? We want to get narrower, and we don't want to be so broad. So try to be clearer about what it is that you're looking for. Now, the point of all of this, if you were wondering, is that your definitions, how you phrase your inquiry, that's going to change what your thesis is going to be, because it's going to change what research you're able to get done in this amount of time. So, for example, this person says, by focusing on providing more efficient funding of health systems, will we be able to save the lives of millions? This is tough because it depends on what you mean by efficient funding and what you mean save lives from what, right? Everyone's going to die, so that means we're picking and choosing who's going to live and not. So the coronavirus has brought this up. There's been a couple news stories about this that say, what should we do, right? And at this point, it sounds like nobody's really making this decision. But if somebody comes in and they have cancer and they're going to die in 6 months and they have coronavirus, should we let them die? Because they'd be using a ventilator that someone else who doesn't have cancer might need. And so what do you mean by efficient? Efficient is usually a word that is used either in utilitarian philosophy, so saying something like, is it better to have 5 people live and 1 person die? Or it's used most commonly in business terms, so money-wise. So the most efficient healthcare system money-wise would be the one that lets the most people die, because that would save the most money, therefore making most money for the hospitals and the medical corporations. If you mean the most efficient funding of a healthcare system to let people live, you'd probably need to look at a government-sponsored healthcare program, like the United Kingdom, Sweden, and maybe China. But the United States is a corporate-based, it's a profit-based healthcare system. So, this is where it gets tricky. So, but depending on how you define that word efficient, that's going to change your research, and it would change your political stance as well. Similar to the next one is that we need to define what we mean by power. This is a good framing of what might need to happen for change to happen at the legislative level, right? For Congress people to pass bills. So we'd want to, but what word we use there, persuade, pressure, motivate, or force, is going to change the research. So force would be violence. Motivate would be kind of like informational. What information could we provide to legislators? Pressure would be the kind of classical thing from political science of interest groups, right? So lobbying, money. And then persuade would be the old-fashioned, what are good arguments that will change people's minds. In the next one, why is it that the issues of international homicide, violence against children, human trafficking, and sexual violence haven't been given a proper solution? I don't, that is a statement that presupposes or assumes that there isn't a proper solution. And there's been a lot of work out in the United Nations, in nonprofit organizations, and in governments that have given proper solutions. The problem is that I don't know what you mean by proper. It seems that you're dissatisfied with the solutions that have been put forward. So, what you'd need to do is pick one of those categories in one place and compare it to another place, look at what solutions that they put forward, and tell me what you don't like about those solutions, and then offer an alternative. But again, depending on how you define proper, and depending on which area you decide to look at, justice is going to be different, and so your thesis is going to change based on those definitions. Next one is, so broad, how can we reduce the injustice? That it depends, right? What do you mean by injustice? Which injustice? And then which victims are you talking about? Because it's going to change depending on who we're talking about. These big abstract concepts, you have to define. So if you don't define these things, then there are no answers, and you certainly won't find any in your research. But again, your definition, how you define these things, will change the direction of your research. So a lot of today has been about defining things, right? You need to make sure you define your terms. So that's my these are the things that you must do if you want to get a good grade on this paper. And again, I will help you with this, but you got to meet me halfway. So you're going to have to put some time in and take your time and slow down. So first thing is consider revising your inquiry questions. So I put up a new Google form, and I'll share that after I share this video and give you some time to process. I'm going to use the inquiry questions for the midterm. So I'll do a midterm prep based on these inquiry questions, and this will be a practice of getting narrower, slowing down, and defining our terms. You need to remember the actor network theory. So we need to stop using generalizations and broad things as the thing we're studying, and we need to talk about human beings. So I need to see way more evidence that there are human beings that cause troubles, and there are human beings that solve troubles. I know that sounds ridiculous. I mean, when I say that out loud, it sounds ridiculous. But this is a common problem. Like I said before, people put out solutions and they forget the human beings. People talk about problems, they forget the human beings, as if these things are things. They're not, right? These are problems that human beings create. So it's going to take human beings to actually fix them. You have to define your terms, define your terms, define your terms, right? Define your terms, define your terms, define your terms. Ideally, you'll find the definitions from the United Nations, from the federal government reports, from the state and city government reports, from academic articles, or from the resources I'm going to give you. If you can't seem to find the definition, it's okay if you start to define it yourself, as long as I know what you're talking about. You should start the introduction now. You're ready to start the introduction. You'll revise your inquiry, you'll revise your thesis, and now it's time to start the introduction. The introduction is the introduction to the problem that you're studying. So you're going to be pulling that information from your preliminary research, from the reports from the United Nations, maybe a newspaper article or two, could be a YouTube video, it could be a documentary that you've seen, right? As long as you cite everything, just keep a list and put it as a works cited at the end. Then you'll be fine, right? And so we just want to get the introduction. Someone's going to ask me how long the introduction should be. Let me put it this way: it shouldn't be more than 3 pages. So if you have more than 3 pages double spaced, then you're leaving the introduction and you're into something else. I think most introductions, good introductions, are probably 1.5 pages. But this is not. I don't do like you have to do 9 pages, right? It doesn't make any sense to me. What makes more sense is write a great research paper. Some research papers need to be 9 pages. Some need to be 6 pages. Some need to be 3 pages. It's going to depend on you. So there's not going to be a set page number in this research project. I'm going to be looking at the actual words you use, the quality of your research, and the experience that you're going through, because I want you to be a great research paper writer after this class. So does John Jay, for those of you going to John Jay. The college is looking for this in particular. So I want to really use this group and this time that we have together to really improve our research and writing together and get really great research. I think this is a good process, and this is what school really should be about, is getting good research, learning things. Share the Google Doc that you already gave me. Okay, don't start a new one. Share the one you already gave me. I'm going to add comments to that doc, and we'll just kind of keep working on it together. Your thesis can be revised. You don't have to, right? You can work off the thesis. I gave people lots of ideas to work off their thesis. Some of you might need to change your thesis, but it needs to be in the introduction section. So as you're introducing the problem, towards the end of the introduction is when you're going to throw the thesis in here and say, now here's what I think is a potential solution, because your research is going to be based on that thesis. Do not move beyond the introduction. So don't say, I'm going to start another section. Don't do that. You're not ready for that, and we're not going to be ready till after the midterm. But you can start doing your research. You can start collecting more information. Feel free to watch some documentaries over spring break, right? I mean, keep doing research, keep taking notes. Just don't go further in your paper. I usually end up reading, watching YouTube videos, watching documentaries, listening to podcasts way more than what I actually use in my paper. It's always good to know too much when you're doing a research project. Because it gives you more to draw from. It gives you more to actually write about. So feel free to keep learning. And for some of you might want to start doing interviews, right? Start talking to people in these weird times, right? I mean, you can set up Zooms with people, right? You can set up Facebook chats with people and start talking to them, getting their opinions on these issues. And that'll give you a better idea of, going back to the identifying people, right? It'll keep you focused on thinking about people and not some abstract thing that you're researching. So I hope this was helpful. Again, I will be helping you through this process. So the main thing is be precise, slow down, and define your terms, right? That's the main thing that we need to remember. And that's what we'll learn moving up to the midterm. That's what I'm going to test you on. So good luck. You'll all do great, and I look forward to reading your papers.